the great fundamental issue now before our peoples in these daily days. It is, are the American people fit to govern themselves, to rule themselves, to control themselves? I believe they are. My opponents do not.
I believe in the American Constitution. I favor the American system of individual enterprise. I am in favor of protection. I believe in the permanent court and further limitation of armament. I am opposed to aggressive war.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Whether we shape the future in the image of our hopes is ours is to determine by our actions and our choices. If we succeed, generations to come will say of us now living that we mastered our moment.
Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
Take the red pill. Listen to the right take.
Hello, everybody. How's it going? This is episode number 91 here on The Right Take. I'm your host, Eric Lendrum, here with my co-host, Jacob Grandstaff. And we are, of course, welcome back, by the way, Jacob. We missed you last week, but thankfully, of course, Tom Pappert
Good to be back.
Yeah, but thankfully that it was a great episode nonetheless, with Tom Pappert agreeing to step into the breach and fill the second chair, and he did so fantastically, as he always does. That was, as always, a fun experience, as it is whenever our good friend Tom is on the show. But now we are back, and we are back to regular business. Again, last week we talked about something very new and different in the form of high-profile internet media drama between Steven Crowder and the Daily Wire. We are back to the nitty-gritty of politics this week, and boy, oh boy, is there a lot to talk about, and I mean a lot to talk about this weekend. Realistically, the first shots have been fired in a proxy war that will ultimately determine what happens in 2024 in the GOP primaries. We will get to that in just a bit. Yes, we are revisiting the Trump versus DeSantis question. But before we do that, we've got to remember, of course, there are other things at stake in 2024 besides the presidential nomination, especially the U.S. Senate. Now, this may sound like a bit of a cope, of course, to say it because, of course, the GOP failed miserably to retake the Senate last November when they really should have. The math was in their favor, and they didn't pull it off. But it needs to be said that the map in 2024, the Senate map, kind of like the 2018 map, is very, overwhelmingly unfavorable to Democrats. That realistically should, at the very least, the GOP should not lose any more seats. I mean, that's a pretty low bar, but it is the Republican Party. But there are some solid pickup opportunities. Going into 2024, the Republicans will have 11 seats up that year, while the Democrats will have 20 seats up for re-election. All the Republican seats are safe red states, by the way. Utah, Wyoming, North Dakota, both Nebraska seats with the resignation of Ben Sasse. Thank God for that. That's a never-Trumper who's gone now. Missouri, Tennessee, Mississippi, Indiana, Texas and Florida. It's the good old boys. It's a lot of the southern states, the deep red rural states. Texas and Florida are the two that, of course, Democrats are likely to target. But as we talked about in our post-election autopsy, realistically, Texas and Florida are they're going to stay red for at least another few election cycles. Democrats' efforts to flip those states blue with, immigration seem to have failed, or at least been set back by a certain number of years. Meanwhile, of the 20 seats that are up for Democrats, at least 8 of them are in decisively competitive seats. Nevada, Arizona, Montana, Wisconsin, Michigan, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. New Mexico and Minnesota are also up in 2022, or in 2024, but I think it's safe. We can agree, Jacob, it's safe to say that after 2022, those 2 states can be written off. Those are states that are always going to be, at best, just frustratingly out of reach. We're probably not going to flip those, so let's not bet money on it. But still some very, very vulnerable seats. West Virginia, Joe Manchin is up for re-election. There's rumblings that Governor Jim Justice may challenge him, and that could actually be someone who could beat him. Certainly.
Just to jump in real quick on that, I think that I do think he is beatable this time. He would have lost last time around if he had not decided to go all in on Trump's Supreme Court picks. If it hadn't been for that, then remember that was during the whole Kavanaugh thing, and he came through and he voted for Kavanaugh. If it hadn't been for that, he would have been gone.
That is very, very true. He did come very close that time. I think he only won by about 6 points, which is much closer than previous elections. He lost to Patrick Morrisey, who I believe is the Attorney General of West Virginia. And yeah, again, Jim Justice is the incumbent governor, elected as a Democrat. Then famously, he switched from Democrat to Republican, announcing it, breaking news, at a rally with Trump. Then he was reelected as a Republican, and now his approval ratings are sky high. They're in the high 60s, whereas Manchin's approval ratings are in the toilet. So yeah, definitely beatable this time. Montana, certainly a very, very red state with just one Democrat senator there who manages to defy the odds and keep getting reelected.
Tester, isn't it? John Tester.
Yes, thank you. It is John Tester. Yeah, John Tester, a very moderate Democrat, in the same vein as Brian Schweitzer, another moderate Democrat from Montana. He has not yet announced if he will run for re-election. If he chooses not to run for re-election, then certainly that seat should be an easy pickup for Republicans. But again, that could be another beatable Democrat in 2024. But what we're going to talk about for this particular episode, this particular topic, we're actually not going to focus on the seats that could flip from blue to red or anything else. We're going to focus on one Senate race that will most likely, more than definitely, not change party hands, but will nonetheless, at least right now, looks like it could change ideologically and for the better. Indiana, one of the Republican seats that's up for re-election. As we talked about before, the incumbent senator there, one-term Senator Mike Braun, who was first elected in 2018, he defeated incumbent Democrat Joe Donnelly in one of the few victories in the Senate for the GOP that year that ultimately helped them increase their majority despite the historical trend. He has now announced that he will not run for re-election. He will instead seek the governorship of Indiana, as the incumbent governor Eric Holcomb is finishing his second term and thus will be termed out in 2024. So basically, Indiana is going to go into 2024 with an open governor's race and an open Senate race. Congressman Jim Banks of Indiana's 3rd Congressional District has announced his candidacy via an exclusive interview with Breitbart. We'll put a link to that in the description below. His other competition, he is the first major candidate to announce. He is most likely going to have competition. It will be a competitive primary, more than likely. His competition may include Ukrainian-born Congresswoman Victoria Spartz, who we previously mentioned in the speaker battle. She, for her very odd, if not crucial, role. Outgoing Governor Eric Holcomb, Mike Pence's successor, may also run, as well as possibly former Governor Mitch Daniels, Mike Pence's predecessor, who left that office to become president of Purdue University. Spartz, as we said, she made the very odd decision to, at a certain point, suddenly change her vote for McCarthy in the speaker battle to present, just voting present, which she did for 8 consecutive ballots. She never sided with the 20 holdouts, but she kind of withdrew her support for McCarthy for a while, then came back to the McCarthy camp. She's already going out of her way, I think, to make very bad decisions ahead of her run. We speculated before that, of course, her decision to vote present might have been an effort to kind of stay in McCarthy's good graces, hoping for his support ahead of her run for Senate. But more recently, this blew me away. She came out very recently to publicly oppose now Speaker McCarthy's decision to kick Adam Schiff, Eric Swalwell, and Ilhan Omar off of their committees, which he said he would do for months, for over a year. He finally did do that. That was a very good thing. That was, we talked about in this episode, talking about the first few moves of his speakership. That was a good thing he did. She opposes that. She's one of only 2 Republicans in the House thus far to have done that. The other being Nancy Mace from South Carolina, who's a flaming never-Trumper. So once again, virtue signaling in support of 3 very radical Democrats. I can't imagine what she thinks she's doing there. Going for a bipartisan approach, maybe. I don't know. But Banks definitely has made his mark, very much made a big splash jumping into this primary. He has become somewhat of a conservative rock star in recent years. I think most recently, he was one of 2 Republicans that Nancy Pelosi refused to seat on the January 6th committee. When they were putting it together, McCarthy initially was going to play ball and say, okay, we'll have a decent number of Republicans. It'll have a slight Democrat majority because Democrats are in the majority in Congress, but it will have a roughly equal number of Republicans. But she specifically said she would not seat Jim Banks or Jim Jordan. She accused them of being most directly responsible for what happened on January 6th, the peaceful protest at the Capitol that day. And it was because of that decision from Pelosi that McCarthy fired right back and said, all right, fine, I'm not going to play this game anymore. And he pulled all of his Republican nominees. He said, I'm not going to seat any Republicans on this committee. This committee is a sham. It's a clown show, which led to it, of course, being all Democrats and then 2 rhinos, Cheney and Kinzinger, who, friendly reminder, they are not in Congress anymore, thank God. Banks was also one of the 126 Republicans in Congress who signed an amicus brief in support of the lawsuit with the Supreme Court that aimed to challenge the results of the election, which was Texas v. Pennsylvania. And he later objected to the certification of the Electoral College results based. He also, among many other things, I love when I looked this up. This was great. He has stood firm against the transgender agenda. When Richard Levine, a mentally ill man who thinks he's a woman and now calls himself Rachel Levine, was promoted to the rank of admiral in the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, the Biden administration celebrated this, first transgender admiral, whatever. Jim Banks tweeted from his official account, quote, "The title of first female 4-star officer gets taken by a man," end quote. What an absolute Chad. He actually got briefly censored or suspended on Twitter for posting that tweet. So
nice.
God bless Jim Banks for that. So why are we talking about this guy who sounds like a pretty solid conservative? That's good. But again, the emphasis needs to be on who he would be replacing. If elected, he would be replacing, again, Senator Mike Braun, who is frustratingly moderate, and I mean moderate very, very loosely there, on key social issues. Global warming is one of them. He believes global warming. He thinks global warming is real. He has called Greta Thunberg, quote, an inspiration, and he has called on the GOP to support more green energy policies. So as far as I'm concerned, trash, throw him in the trash right then and there. But the one thing that really is the worst about Braun is that in June of 2020, he came out in full-fledged, unapologetic support of the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund the police agenda. He particularly defended the BLM response to the shooting of Rayshard Brooks. If you remember that case, Jacob, that was in front of a Wendy's in Atlanta, an insane man who I believe he was definitely under the influence of drugs and or alcohol. I think he fell asleep behind the wheel of his car in the drive-thru of Wendy's. So the Wendy's employees called the cops. They're like, oh, this guy suddenly fell asleep, acting strangely. We need the police here. So they showed up. Surveillance camera caught all of it. He, of course, was woken up, not in the best of moods, and freaked out. He resisted arrest. He managed to steal one of the officers' tasers, then ran away with it. As they chased him through the parking lot, he turned around and fired the taser at one of the officers, at which point the officers then drew out their guns and returned fire and killed him. A justified shooting. It was all caught on camera. But Braun came out opposing that, opposing the response of the police, basically saying the officers were guilty and supporting BLM and the defund the police efforts. And he actually went out of his way to introduce legislation in support of the BLM agenda. And this earned him the rage, the righteous indignation of Tucker Carlson, who covered it on his show on Fox News. And
yeah, I remember that.
This was really good. We're going to play a couple of clips here from that episode, just as a reminder of who this Republican senator really is.
As we told you last week, Senator Mike Braun of Indiana has introduced legislation to make it easier for left-wing activists to sue police officers. We must do this, Senator Braun explained, in part because Rayshard Brooks' death was egregious.
I wanted to put a template out there that protects law enforcement from frivolous lawsuits, but holds the egregious departments and individuals accountable in these egregious, instances of a George Floyd, a Rayshard Brooks, a Breonna Taylor.
In case you suspect we somehow selectively edited that clip, here's Republican Senator Braun going all the way in endorsing Black Lives Matter.
You support the Black Lives Matter movement.
I support that movement because it's addressing an inequity that has not been solved, from a grassroots level.
Big yikes there. So then, of course, Tucker went on to have the senator on his show in this very same episode, and he held absolutely nothing back. It was truly merciless. And one thing I'm going to summarize here before I go back to the clip is that he, at one point, Braun's defense of that stance when Tucker grilled him is he said, I'm coming from the mainstream. I'm coming from the mainstream position of supporting this movement, which basically said, it was translated means, I'm supporting the current thing. I'm supporting the trend, the fad. All the corporations were posting the black square and the black power fist. There were plenty. Mitt Romney was marching with Black Lives Matter. So at the time, of course, with the initial
basically he's given into the mob.
Gave into the mob completely. They completely kowtowed. Oh yeah, George Floyd was murdered. It was horrendous. He didn't die of a fentanyl overdose. He was murdered by Derek Chauvin. Breonna Taylor was murdered. Rayshard Brooks was murdered. They were all murdered. He just really did not want the mob to come after him. And Tucker doubled down on this and would not let him get away with it. And we're going to play this clip at 1.25 speed because it's a longer clip, but also because Braun, like a politician, talks frustratingly slow. So for your convenience and ours, we're going to speed this up. But this is, I think, the highlight of the exchange between them.
Have you read their website, or are you in favor of abolishing the nuclear family? What do you support exactly?
No,
in the Black
I'm not
Lives
at
movement?
all.
What does that mean? Okay.
I support anybody that does have a grievance to be able to air it. And that's it. That doesn't mean all lives don't matter. It just means that if you think a certain sector of society has a grievance, it ought to be through transparency and the willingness to debate it and get it out there. I'm going to always go on the merits of the particular case. And going back to what I learned last week, first of all, law enforcement in Indiana was talking about eliminating it or drastically modifying it. This was to find that sweet spot to where they said they are being unduly stigmatized because of these events, because in some cases, their own aren't held accountable. And when they knew that, they basically said, we need to be in the discussion. Look how we got rolled with Obamacare when we refused to discuss it 10 years ago.
I'm sorry. We just showed tape of you, Senator, saying that we need to pull back. We need to make it easier to sue the police because of, quote, egregious incidents like the death of Rayshard Brooks. You said you wanted to speak about specifics. Do you believe that he was killed unjustly? Do you believe Officer Rolfe deserves the death penalty, which he now faces? What did you mean by that, please?
I believe you ought to have the ability to, just like when anyone's civil rights would be violated, that you've got access to due process, to have your case heard.
But they do. But they do have that right. Qualified immunity, hold on. Qualified immunity has nothing to do with that case. He's been charged. They have the right to sue him under qualified immunity, as you know, since you're writing the change to the law. So that's irrelevant. I'm asking about the case. You cited it. Do you believe that the officer now facing the death penalty deserves to face the death penalty? And if you don't, tell us what he should have done.
I think that's going to be determined by the court. And when it comes to that
civil... You cited it. So wait, hold on. You cited it. What do you think of it? You're the one who called it egregious, so why don't you tell us what Officer Rolfe should have done when this man fired a taser at him? What do you think?
I think that you probably should have had the judgment that in a traffic stop like that, you don't shoot somebody in the back. So,
wait, it's not even a traffic stop.
It's not. Yeah, no, it's not a traffic stop.
He doesn't even know what happened.
He clearly knows nothing. Yeah, it was not a traffic stop. He was in a Wendy's drive-thru. The Wendy's employees called the cops on him. And secondly, says you shouldn't shoot them in the back. He didn't get shot in the back. He turned around to fire the taser at the cops, at which point the cops returned fire as he was facing them, pointing a weapon at them. So no, this is just like what I talked about when I was in high school and my leftist classmates went all in on the Trayvon Martin case, not knowing a damn thing about the case, and said, oh, George Zimmerman is a racist. He ran up and shot Trayvon in the back of the head, which obviously is not what happened once the autopsy and the other reports came out. But again, he just went along with the trend. He went along with the fad because he was terrified of the mob, which at the time this interview was happening, cities were all literally burning across the country. So I'm glad Tucker roasted him for that and utterly humiliated him. That is still one of the all-time best Tucker takedowns, I think, ever. And I think at the end of the day, men like Braun or Joe Donnelly, the Democrat before him, are remnants of a period not too long ago where Indiana was almost leaning towards swing state status. Remember, Obama narrowly won the state in 2008 by a little more, about 1%, literally 1 percentage point over John McCain. So if Braun is ultimately indeed replaced by a hardcore conservative like Banks, it will be another example of the GOP finally taking steps to shift further to the right by replacing moderates with grassroots conservatives, like Richard Burr in North Carolina being replaced by Ted Budd, or Asa Hutchinson in Arkansas being replaced by Sarah Huckabee Sanders. We should not have any patience for these so-called moderates, especially in red states. It's one thing if you got like a Susan Collins in Maine. The pragmatist in me is willing to accept, okay, if she got primaried out, kind of like what happened in the election for Biden's Senate seat in Delaware with that lady who primaried out the governor, the popular governor who was supposed to win that seat for Joe Biden's former Senate seat, but she was a hardcore conservative. She said, I'm not a witch, and she got crushed. So if something similar like that happened to Susan Collins and a crazy conservative beat her, she would then get destroyed in the general election. I'm willing to understand that. But in Indiana, we do not need someone like this in a state like Indiana.
No, totally agree. And the thing is, people think of Indiana the way they think of Missouri. It's very similar in Iowa, really. Those are states that have turned hard to the right ever since Black Lives Matter became a thing. And even before then, even during the Obama administration, those states started drifting from purple to pink. And then now they're solidly red. And you need senators that represent that demographic.
Absolutely. And again, Jim Banks is the first major candidate thus far, but there's already some good signs for his campaign. He's racked up some major endorsements in his bid, including Senator Tom Cotton, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, Congressman Greg Pence, the brother of Mike Pence, so that's a big deal in Indiana, the Club for Growth, and Turning Point Action, the 501c4 branch of Turning Point USA, which of course is the largest conservative student group in the country and a very pro-Trump group. Realistically, I think all Banks needs is Trump's endorsement, and I think he is a solid frontrunner for the nod. However, I will say this, don't want to get our hopes up. Nothing is certain, and there's always a chance that we could see a repeat of the Mo Brooks fiasco. Jacob, of course, in your home state of Alabama, we all thought when Mo Brooks first announced he was running for the Senate in 2022, and Trump endorsed him right out the gate, oh, surely it's over. This time, he's finally going to win the nomination that he lost in 2017. We're going to have a really based America First, tough on immigration senator, but obviously one thing led to another. He just didn't campaign well or whatever it was, and he ended up crashing and burning miserably. So
I don't know how the case is in Indiana with Jim Banks, how popular he is across the state, but in Alabama, the issue with Brooks is Brooks was popular. He was one of the Tea Party darlings who became popular nationwide. You have these stars, these internet stars, who are extremely popular with the base. People in Wyoming know who they are, but people in their own district don't know who they are. Now, people in Brooks' district did know who he was. The problem was people in other districts in Alabama didn't know who he was and knew nothing about him. So this is one of the things that Matt Gaetz is probably going to run into problems with if he tries to go on to something bigger and better. It's good to be popular in your own district and nationwide with the base, but if you want to run like a statewide campaign, then people in other districts who you don't represent have to know who you are. It's not enough to get donations from Wyoming and Idaho, because those people can't vote for you. So hopefully Jim Banks is popular throughout the entire state of Indiana, not just in his own district and online.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm sure he's well known within his own district, certainly these days. But keep in mind, again, the competition I mentioned that could go up against him includes two governors, the current governor and a former governor who, again, is currently president of a prominent university there. So if it comes down purely to name recognition, he might have trouble, again, even with a Trump endorsement. But we'll have to wait and see. And, Godspeed to Congressman Banks. Hopefully he does sweep this nomination and we get someone solid in there to replace this absolute clown who is on his way out. So, speaking of elections, of course, getting back down into the really deep insider baseball politics. Oh, we've got to talk about this. We previewed it already in our previous episode, episode number 86. The RNC chair race, of course, that did take place on Friday, January the 27th. And it was more or less, I think, what we expected, or what we didn't officially predict, but what realistically most people were expecting. I was talking to some of my sources who said that they heard that going into the election, Ronna Romney McDaniel had between 110 and 120 votes out of, again, 168 total. You need 85 for a majority. And sure enough, she did get 111 votes. First ballot. It didn't have to go to multiple ballots like the speaker's race. She won an absolute landslide. That was nearly 67% of the vote. She got 111 votes from RNC committee members. Harmeet Dhillon, a distant second, 51 votes. So, Ronna McDaniel literally got more than twice as many votes as her. Mike Lindell, third place with 4 votes. And former Congressman and New York gubernatorial nominee Lee Zeldin, despite not being officially nominated and despite not actually running, he got 1 vote. So that's 167 total votes. Apparently there was one member of the 168 who didn't vote. I don't know what the story is with that. But yeah, that's the result. It was over fairly quickly. They had the election in California for some reason. I'm not sure why it was over there. So we need to take some time, of course, to further explain why, because obviously the reaction, if you go on like Twitter, conservative Twitter, the reaction overwhelmingly is, oh, this sucks. The do-nothing rhino got reelected. Harmeet should have won. This is terrible. And first off, we need to explain, kind of like with the speaker's race, why, if anything, this probably was the better outcome versus a Harmeet Dhillon victory. So, of course, Jacob, we had this discussion semi-debate between you and I in episode 86, where I said I was willing to bite the bullet and support Harmeet Dhillon only because Ronna McDaniel has proven completely incompetent, despite the fact that Harmeet Dhillon has a well-documented record of being anti-America first, hardcore moderate, donated to Kamala Harris's campaign. She was cut her teeth out of the San Francisco GOP. She was definitely not ideologically on our side, versus Ronna McDaniel, who doesn't seem ideologically hostile, but is just incompetent at the job. So I'm sure, of course, you stand by your opinion there. You want to maybe take some time to expand a little bit more on why this is ultimately the better outcome?
Yes, primarily because I'm not a fan of the idea of the anybody but idea. This is what we get a lot of times whenever you've got a Democrat in office. You'll have Republican voters, and especially, and of course, the party itself really likes getting behind this idea. Oh, anybody but Obama. We'll take anything and anybody but Obama that has a beating heart. The problem with that is you will probably end up with anybody but that candidate. I mean, think about if Trump had decided not to run. Well, actually, I'm talking about Obama. He didn't run in 2012.
That's
and
right.
What did we get? We got Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
So that's what ends up happening when you have that mentality of anybody but. The voters were like anybody but Obama, and so we end up with Mitt Romney, sleepy Mitt Romney, as the nominee.
And because that was during the 2012 primaries, I remember that was the first presidential election in which I was fully tuned in and fully involved. The overall, the consistent theme throughout the primary is, oh, Romney is not really a conservative. Who will be the anti-Romney? And so many other characters, Herman Cain, rest in peace, Newt Gingrich, Rick Santorum. But the one thing that kept Romney afloat through the primaries and that kept him firm, it kept him stable as one challenger after the other rose and fell was, who is the most electable? Who is the most likely to beat Obama? And it was always in the polls. It was always Romney. So, of course, for that reason alone, they nominated, the man who would go on to become a hardcore never-Trumper, pro-impeachment, all these things that we know now he is not at all even remotely conservative, despite himself once describing himself as, what did he say, severely conservative? I think that's how he described himself to try to pander to the base.
Oh, it's like it's an illness.
Terminally,
like it's a disease.
Terminally conservative, yes.
Terminally conservative.
Exactly.
I have no choice. I'm a Mormon in Utah. I'm terminally conservative. I have no, despite my personal feelings, I have to pretend to be a conservative. But anyway, this is the same situation with the House Speaker race. You had all the anybody but McCarthy voters, and I'm talking about the base. They didn't want McCarthy to be Speaker again, and so they're like, would you give us anything and anybody but McCarthy? And so the House Freedom Caucus, of course, opposed McCarthy, but they never presented any serious challengers to McCarthy. Now, we understand they were just seeking concessions. But if you want to believe that, and a lot of the base probably does believe that they genuinely wanted to unseat McCarthy, well, you have to present a candidate that people want to vote for, not just because he's not McCarthy. And this is what happens in a lot of European countries. The prime minister will be very unpopular. So they'll just vote to get rid of him, and they'll put somebody in, and they're like, well, this guy's no better than the last, and they just keep turning over the government every 6 months. And this is what you're going to have with the RNC. Harmeet Dhillon is not somebody that the base wanted, because they did poll the average Republican voter. That is correct, yes. You actually were the one who showed this to me. I was not aware that any polling was being done on this race because, again, this is not an open primary. This wasn't something the voters could vote on, unfortunately. This was among just that elite group of the 168 RNC members. But, of course, at least one pollster did ask the base, Republican voters at large, who they would support for RNC chair. So this was interesting. This is from Rasmussen, which is one of the... So this is from Rasmussen Reports, which is pretty much the dominant conservative pollster. It's the major right-wing pollster, more so than any other. When you see the name Rasmussen, you know it's going to be a poll that will be more friendly to Republicans. And in this poll, posted the day before the election, so Thursday the 26th, one day before the RNC election. This is the close of the race.
Here's how voters are feeling. 30% wanted Mike Lindell to be RNC chair. Honestly, I'm not surprised by that. 21%, second highest option, 21% were undecided the day before the election. Now, that's actually a serious problem. It's one thing, because that never happens in a regular election, like a primary for Senate or president or anything. The day before the election, you're not going to have that many people undecided. Most people have made up their minds by the point that it's 24 hours before the election. So that just goes to show that maybe the race didn't really get as much coverage as we political wonks thought it did. And a lot of this maybe proves that at least a significant
no, of
portion.
course not. That's the thing. Only the most politically in tune to the grassroots actually even knew this race was going on. So you do have to discount the masses out there, like 80% of the country who literally don't know what Twitter is hardly. They don't watch the news. They don't keep up. So obviously this is the more in tune grass. Like these are your business owners. These are your people who have a little bit higher standard of living than your average worker that, Trump is going to need in the general election.
Exactly. And in which case it makes more sense why Lindell was the top choice, considering, he's an outsider, so I'm sure for that reason alone, especially Trump supporters are like, oh, we want a real political outsider, because he was the one true outsider in this race. But also B, because he's got name recognition. His products are always being advertised on Fox News, on Newsmax, on like every conservative station ever. Everyone knows the name. Everyone knows, hi, I'm Mike Lindell. Like everyone knows that. So name recognition, certainly. He had more name recognition, certainly, than these people do. But back to the poll, 30% Lindell, 21% undecided. Third place, 20% for Harmeet Dhillon. 15% supporting someone other than these three, so a variety of other candidates, whether Lee Zeldin or whoever, and tied for that, another 15%, Ronna McDaniel. So she was unpopular with the base. She was dead last in this poll, but Harmeet didn't exactly have broad support either. She polled below the undecided option, which is pretty bad.
Yeah, and that was what I was going to point out. The majority of those polled said that they wanted someone other than Ronna McDaniel. So you did have the Never McDaniel core voters. That was the majority of the base. But here's the problem. The base themselves, the voters out there, they wanted Mike Lindell. They did have a candidate, someone they wanted to vote for, not just because he wasn't Ronna McDaniel, but they genuinely supported Lindell to be the chair of the Republican Party. But and this is the thing that you have to understand about party politics. The voter does not choose who's going to run the party. It doesn't matter how long he's been a Republican voter. It is the elites of the party elites, the members of the RNC chair members. They are the ones who decide. And they did not back Lindell the way the grassroots did. So you ask, okay, who did they want in place of Ronna McDaniel? And Harmeet Dhillon was the one who stepped forward to be the not McDaniel, so that's why she got as much support as she did. But you're right, the base, the average voter, they didn't want Harmeet. Like the only reason why she polled as high as she did among the base with Rasmussen is probably because her name was in the news. Like she was going on Tucker Carlson, other interviews. People had never heard of Harmeet Dhillon before this, and it's like, okay, she's running to defeat Ronna McDaniel, so I hope she wins because Ronna McDaniel's been running the party into the ground.
Exactly. Those who knew who Harmeet Dhillon was prior to this are certainly political people who are tuned in politically, but more particularly prior to her becoming more prominent on the national stage, people from California, like myself. And like I said in that episode, people from California know her record. Real conservatives know her record. She was moderate on the issues at best. She actively campaigned against America First candidates. She worked for the ACLU in the aftermath of 9/11 because evil white people are mistaking Sikhs for Muslims and that's bad. Like so many things. She donated to Kamala Harris. So many things. She is definitely not ideal in terms of ideology. Maybe she would have been better on the process, on ballot harvesting, what have you. Maybe. But as you said, Jacob, there was a good chance that had she become RNC chair, she would have weaponized ballot harvesting against pro-Trump candidates. So consider that versus Ronna McDaniel, who just doesn't know how to ballot harvest. She picks up a ballot harvest. She picks up a paper ballot, looks at it, and probably tries to turn a TV on with it like a remote or something. She's that clueless when it comes to what ballot harvesting is. But ultimately, there actually are plenty of reasons for why it was such a blowout. Because I said, as a member of the RNC, Dhillon could come close. I still figured this was Ronna's race to lose, but Dhillon could make it competitive. No, she got absolutely blown out. Why is that? One article I came across is at townhall.com, great website. We'll put the link in the description below. And it focuses on one main reason why she may have lost, despite having an insider advantage, or at least having an understanding of how the game is played, unlike someone like Mike Lindell. her campaign, and especially her surrogates, were way too aggressive in whipping votes. They got very hostile with people who were on the fence. They made it a dichotomy, black or white. You are either for us or you're for Ronna McDaniel, George Bush style. You're either with us or you're for the terrorists. So, as detailed in this article, which cites a Politico article, Dhillon had spent the campaign focusing more, as you mentioned, Jacob, more on raising her media profile by doing high-profile interviews with the likes of Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and Charlie Kirk, among others. So she's making the media round. She's making herself well-known to viewers, but that's, again, the Fox News viewers are not choosing the RNC chair. All this resulted in is that she apparently, according to Politico, she risked alienating moderate, aka cucked, members of the RNC who don't like such firebrand personalities. Oh, Tucker and Laura Ingraham and Charlie Kirk, they're radical. They're nasty. They spend just as much time attacking Ronna as they do supporting Harmeet. And some members in particular apparently took issue with Charlie Kirk. Again, founder of Turning Point USA. He's a very staunch Trump ally. He has been, since 2020 especially, he has been on the warpath against voter fraud, CRT, transgenderism. He is solid on these things. He speaks, and the base does love someone like Charlie Kirk. So, but apparently RNC types didn't like him very much. So according to David Brock, an RNC member from Tennessee and a supporter of Harmeet, several RNC members approached Dhillon and said they would be willing to support her if it weren't for the fact that Charlie Kirk was supporting her. Which, I mean, that's a pretty lame reason. But again, that's the kind of people these people are. Dhillon reassured them that she reassured them of such concerns by claiming that Kirk would not be involved with RNC staff if she were to win. However, their issue subsequently was that there was never an assurance from her that she would tell Kirk to, quote, dial down his support for her. Basically, that she wouldn't call off her war dogs. She wouldn't tell them to stop attacking Ronna McDaniel. And why would she? These are your surrogates. Of course, attacking your opponent is half the battle. So I don't know why, again, they would think that's a reasonable request from them for Harmeet to do that, to basically stop campaigning. But whatever. It then gets even worse. Apparently, Dhillon's top campaign advisor in her RNC bid is a woman named Caroline Wren, who I'd never heard of this woman before, but apparently she previously worked for Kari Lake's gubernatorial campaign in Arizona. She spent the last few days recklessly accusing everyone who didn't support Harmeet, not just a supporter. She would accuse people of whipping vote Daniel. If you don't vote for Harmeet, you must be actively encouraging people to support Ronna McDaniel. She went on to Steve Bannon's War Room to directly accuse President Trump himself of doing this through campaign surrogate David Bossie. He was the former deputy campaign manager of Trump's 2016 campaign. And I actually didn't know this until today when I did the research. He's a member of the RNC committee as well from Maryland. So he's a voting member. So it makes sense that he is going to be more involved in the process. Although it is public knowledge that Bossie supports Ronna McDaniel, there is no proof that he was doing this on Trump's behalf. So just making stuff up, tying it directly to Trump, which is just disgusting to do. Then, I didn't know. So one of our mutual friends, Jacob, actually shared this. She set her sights, like laser focus, on Vernon Jones, the former Georgia state representative, who of course was a Democrat, turned Republican, ran for governor, then dropped out of the primary to run for Congress, then ultimately fell short in the runoff, unfortunately. She apparently targeted Vernon Jones with an abundance of profanity. This is from the Politico article. She apparently confronted Vernon Jones when she discovered he wasn't going to support Harmeet. She said, quote, "Everyone knows you're here effing whipping votes for Ronna." She then called him an effing sellout and said, quote, "The grassroots will never support you again," end quote. Of course, I'm censoring that. She just like dropping F-bombs in every other sentence. She then apparently approached Jones on 2 more occasions during the RNC meeting. One of which, both times, she barged in on a conversation he was having with someone else. One time, he was talking to another member of the RNC just so she could call him, quote, "the effing enemy." So barging in on his conversation with someone else to embarrass him basically in front of someone else and try to, grandstand for this person. Then she did the same thing again while he was talking to, wait for it, her former boss, Kari Lake. Vernon Jones is just chatting with Kari Lake, and she barges in the conversation to call him, quote, "a sellout." So then,
so I just want to look. This is stuff like this kind of behavior. This is what you would have seen from far left Democrats 20 years ago,
yes,
who would not have been invited into polite Democratic company. You would have not seen this among any Republicans anywhere for any reason. it just shows this is a reflection of the culture. Like whenever you have people who are political operatives around people, like other political operatives, all in suits and nice dresses, and they're just dropping F-bombs in the middle of, chewing people out like this, acting like children, really acting like petty teenagers. It shows the degradation of our culture and how the top operatives of the Republican Party are being dragged, not even kicking and screaming. They're being dragged willingly by the far left of the Democratic Party. Like this kind of behavior wouldn't have been acceptable among Democrats even 15 years ago.
No. It really, and it shows these people are just so perpetually angry. And to me, among other things, like you said, degradation of our culture, it also is her just projecting her frustrations that they probably knew going into this that they were going to lose, and she just has to take it out on somebody. By the way, lastly, the Politico report notes Jones's response. A reporter questioned him about the multiple hostile encounters, and he apparently, according to this reporter, he, quote, simply shrugged, smiled, and said, "There's not much more to say," end quote. What an absolute Chad. What a king move from Vernon Jones. Man. The hysterical woman is screaming and cursing at him in front of other people, and he just laughs it off. I can totally picture that happening, by the way. So good for...
I'm not going to say anything, but I know a little bit about Vernon Jones to know that this is not something that would be beneath him in private, most likely, but being a gentleman, he's going to show the public face of the gentleman as just like she should. Like if she wants to do this, like she should do it behind closed doors where nobody else is going to witness it.
Right, exactly. To do it in public just shows you have absolutely no shame. So again, I've never heard this woman before. Hopefully she does not get anywhere near positions of power or prominence anymore. If this is how she treats potential allies, potential supporters, and is just going to drop F-bombs like this with absolutely zero class whatsoever. One more thing the Politico report notes, a delightfully ironic nail in Harmeet's campaign coffin. This is, when I saw this, I'm like, I believed it right away, and that just makes it so much more delicious. RNC members said that in the final days of the campaign, Dhillon's whip team began sending an excessive amount of calls and emails begging for support, which turned off a lot of the on-the-fence members who may have wanted to vote for Harmeet, and they decided to stick with Rona because she was just pestering them with the texts and the emails and phone calls. Just imagine, with all the complaints already out there, that the RNC is sending way too many emails, text messages, phone calls, always begging for money, begging for email addresses, even with elections years away, demanding that you sign up for their latest list. The woman running to supposedly change all of that ends up going down for doing the exact same thing that she's trying to stop or to change. That's just further proof she would have been no different. She would have been no different from Ronna McDaniel. And probably that's for the worse, obviously. Again, it comes down to a matter of ideology at that point, where we know deep down inside she has these deep-seated hostilities towards the America First ideology. So Harmeet goes down in flames. It wasn't even close. Jacob definitely vindicated here. Eric sitting here eating crow over the fact that I was willing to support Harmeet Dhillon, and I'm happy to admit that I was wrong. And again, these stories about her supporters and her surrogates acting like this, I'm glad to admit I was wrong, and you know what? I'll join you now, Jacob. Late to the party, but I'll join you on this. I'm glad Ronna McDaniel won. Of the choices, the realistic choices, again, Lindell would have been nice, but he never had a shot. He absolutely never had a chance. So it was a good try from Based Pillow, man. But
it would be nice if there was some kind of ranked, like some way in which the base could give their input. Like maybe if you had the RNC members, maybe if they voted and then the voters also voted themselves, like Republican voters voted themselves, and the RNC members, their votes counted for 30%. It was weighted, like a weighted voting system where their votes were weighted against, and then at least that way the average person would have some say. They would have some voice in the system.
Exactly. Or even then, something like what the UK does. So we mentioned, of course, in the UK, they throw out governments regularly. But one thing they do, the Conservative Party in the UK does this, and they did this most recently, the last couple of leadership elections, including when Boris Johnson took over, and then subsequently with the woman who took over after him, who lasted for like less than 30 days. See, I don't even remember her name. That's how insignificant she was. But the MPs, the conservative members of parliament, have to come together to nominate candidates for leadership. And each candidate must get a certain amount of nominations to be placed on the ballot. So like 100 or 60 nominations from fellow MPs or something. So you have Boris Johnson, you have a couple of other people, and then they ultimately do their own voting amongst themselves, kind of like, the speaker's race, multiple ballots to gradually eliminate people. And when it comes down to the top two, they ultimately eliminate everyone else and get down to the top two. They then, who again, nominated and voted upon by members of parliament, those top two are then put to a ballot among voting members of the party, like the regular people, the regular voters who get to vote nationwide by submitting ballots. I'm not sure if it was an online vote or not, but so it's a fairly small voting pool, but still voting. It's conducted among members of the Conservative Party, registered voters. I mean, the regular people who ultimately, that's how Boris Johnson was ultimately elected prime minister. So something like that system, say the RNC, certain candidates have to get a certain number of nominations to be placed into consideration, and then you send the ballot out, like send the ballot of the three-way ballot of Ronna McDaniel, Harmeet Dhillon, and Mike Lindell out to the voting public. Something like that would be pretty nice. I agree. But unfortunately, that's not how it's done. That's not how the game is played, at least for now. So maybe in the future, maybe some reforms like that could be done under a real leadership change when we get it. Because Ronna McDaniel has announced this will be her final term. It's her fourth and final term. Again, historic record. No one's ever served four terms before. Reince Priebus before her served only 3. So she'll be gone. So in another 2 years, we will get a new chair. Hopefully someone better. Someone not Harmeet. Somebody else. Maybe a real outsider. Who knows? But the drama, the fun, my friends, has only just begun. Courtesy of, this could have been just a relatively normal bit of insider baseball that, like we said before, Jacob, most of the base wouldn't even be aware of. But this ended up becoming a proxy war going into the 2024 presidential primary due to a last-minute 11th-hour endorsement by a possible candidate. Florida man, Governor Ron DeSantis, endorsed Harmeet Dhillon in an interview with Charlie Kirk on the 26th, Thursday, less than 24 hours before the election. And we're going to go ahead and play that clip here of DeSantis officially in this little sit-down with Charlie Kirk, formally endorsing Harmeet Dhillon.
Well, we've had 3 substandard election cycles in a row, 18, 20, and 22. And I would say of all 3 of those, 22 was probably the worst, given the political environment of a very unpopular president in Biden. Huge majorities of the people think the country's going in the wrong direction. That is an environment that's tailor-made to make big gains in the House and the Senate and state houses all across the country, and yet that didn't happen. And in fact, we even lost ground in the U.S. Senate. And so, I think we need a change. I think we need to get some new blood in the RNC. I like what Harmeet Dhillon has said about getting the RNC out of D.C. Why would you want to have your headquarters in the most Democrat city in America? It's more Democrat than San Francisco is.
Okay, so
I mean, I get that. I get that sentiment, but as far as moving the headquarters, but Washington, D.C. is the capital of the country. It doesn't matter how Democratic it is. You can't just pull everything conservative and Republican out of D.C. Right. It's never going to be a centrist city. It's never going to be a right-leaning city. That's just the way it is. That's where the bureaucracy is. Most bureaucrats are Democrats. They've always been. They've always have been. You can't play this game. Well, I'm going to get us out of D.C. Well, you're going to change the capital too?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know exactly what he's going for there, by the way. That's a reference, of course, to the fact that towards the end of his term, one thing Trump was working to do to really take a sledgehammer to the deep state and do some serious damage is he was starting to move the headquarters of federal agencies out of D.C. all across America. I briefly worked in the Interior Department, and he had the plans were underway to move the headquarters of the Interior Department to Colorado, a state full of natural beauty and parks and whatnot. That makes sense. And that is one suggestion that has been put out there for a second term for Trump that would actually work. But here's the key difference. Here's why that approach would work for federal agencies, but would not work for the RNC. The federal agencies, by moving their headquarters to other states, what you would be doing then is by putting them in red states, putting, this Department of Education in North Dakota or something like that. Obviously, at that point, the headquarters are now going to be surrounded by people who are more conservative. You're in an area where most of the residents are conservative. They're just regular rural voters who that's a great way, a fantastic way. By proximity, you're giving them an incentive to join the federal government and work for the federal government and replace professional bureaucrats. Do you think, as we mentioned, Jacob, DC is the home of professional bureaucrats? How many of those people do you think are so desperate to hold on to power, they will move to backwater Montana, right? Which they detest so much. They hate flyover country. They hate these states. No, they're not going to do that. So that is how you decapitate the federal bureaucracy and get real Americans in there, patriots and conservative voters in there. That would work because obviously it's a matter of the hiring pool. And you can hire anybody to work for these agencies. The RNC does not work like that. RNC, the leadership, are still elected by the 168 members who are elected by their individual state parties. Again, all 50 states, 5 territories, Washington, D.C. By moving it to Florida, you're not going to change who the leadership of the RNC is, because you can't fundamentally change the voting base of the RNC, which again is the 168 members from all the states and territories, irrespective of where the headquarters are. So what's that going to do? Moving the headquarters out of DC? That's a purely symbolic gesture that means absolutely nothing. And of course, as I already suggested there with the comparison to Trump's move against the deep state, it's an attempt to copy Trump. And that's where we get to the meat of this matter. First off, we got to discuss this, Jacob, because these are 2 very likely theories on DeSantis' endorsement there. Again, last minute, 11th hour endorsement. Is this a calculated ploy by DeSantis, by a professional politician, or is this just a last minute fence sitting move by a spineless politician who doesn't know which way to go? Now, the argument in favor of calculated ploy, of course, the theory goes that DeSantis knew ultimately, again, as my sources knew, as most people in the know knew 24 hours ahead of time, Harmeet was going to lose. DeSantis did this knowing Harmeet would lose and incumbent, Rhino, Ron McDaniel, would get reelected. So he made an endorsement just so he and all of his paid shills who were already out there in droves, and we'll talk about that in a bit, could then turn around and say, oh, Trump supported Ronna McDaniel and she just won and she beat our outsider. Trump is the establishment now. He's become the swamp. Ron DeSantis, I supported the outsider. They essentially would set up this idea that DeSantis is running to the right of Trump, which literally, laugh out loud, that is a hilariously incorrect assumption that could not be further from the truth. There is a likelihood that this was indeed very much planned out. The Daily Beast just did what is perhaps the first ever hit piece on a would-be DeSantis 2024 campaign. Because up to this point, of course, the media has been pampering him. Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski on MSNBC are praising DeSantis. That they obviously want him to...
Wait, what are they praising him about? That's interesting.
It was from a while ago. They're basically saying, he has class. He's so much nicer than Trump. There was a clip a while ago. I'd have to try to go back and dig that clip up. If you want, Jacob, I'll go ahead.
Because he hasn't really implemented any policy that I could imagine them agreeing with.
I'll take some time if I can and try to find it. But yeah, all it is they just want him to knock off Trump. They want him to get Trump out of the running because 2024, as we said, is Trump's last chance to run for president, realistically speaking. So anybody but Trump, the left, like we said, anybody but. The left does not want Trump back in the picture. So they'll take DeSantis, whether it's, the Murdoch Empire, New York Post, Wall Street Journal, Fox News, simping for DeSantis, or leftists who just don't want Trump. But
whenever I first heard this, I was actually kind of shocked that DeSantis had waded into the RNC race, because I had assumed that he would just completely stay out of it, because he stayed out of the Georgia races. He stayed out of the House Speaker race. He didn't even comment or tweet anything about the House Speaker race. And when you told me that he had endorsed Dhillon, I thought that's kind of, especially the last minute, I thought that's very out of character for DeSantis. So I went to his Twitter feed, and he hadn't tweeted anything about it. So I thought, well, that's kind of a weird endorsement. He's going to endorse a candidate for RNC chair, and he doesn't even tweet about it. Like, I give my endorsement to this person. But when you listen to the clip, it's not an actual endorsement. He's asked his opinion, and he says that Harmeet Dhillon would make a better choice than Ronna McDaniel, which is it's plausible deniability. Like, if Harmeet happens to win, then he can come back and say, well, look, I endorsed Harmeet Dhillon and Harmeet Dhillon won. Look, I helped push her over the top. If she loses, then he can say, I never endorsed Harmeet Dhillon. I was asked a question. I just gave my honest answer. So this is perfect. It almost does sound like a setup. Like, they asked him, will you endorse Harmeet? And he's like, well, I don't really want to put my neck out, but what if you're asked? What if you're put on the spot? Well, then, I guess I can give my honest opinion about what I think I would do in that particular situation. It's politician BS. That's basically all that is.
That it really is. And that, of course, goes to the second theory, which is that he's just a fence sitter, like a professional politician. DeSantis clearly, despite being coronated as the new leader of the party, he refuses to take risks. Like you said, he was nowhere to be seen during the Georgia Senate runoff. Even though Georgia is literally one state over, it would be so easy to go to Georgia. And if you're so popular, Ron, if you're really the future, as the New York Post called you that day after the midterms, like as if we didn't see that coming a mile away, why would you not go down there and rally support for Herschel Walker in a very crucial Senate runoff? He was nowhere to be seen in the speaker's race, where, again, I think, as I said before, he was just seething at the fact that the star of the conservative resistance in the speaker's race was another Florida Republican, Matt Gaetz. He couldn't stand the fact that another Florida Republican was upstaging him, so he just kept quiet. But again, leader of the party has nothing to say on this very consequential speaker's race? You don't say. He will not take risks. And this is also a very likely theory. Because, for example, going into 2024, most of these politicians want to try to build up their profile. They want to show that they are a serious player on the national stage. And another name, of course, that has been floated as a possible non-Trump candidate in 24 is Glenn Youngkin, my governor, the governor of Virginia. But Youngkin, realistically, I have no qualms about saying this on the air. I would rather have, if Trump is out of the picture, I would rather have Youngkin than DeSantis for a presidential candidate. And here's why. Youngkin, unlike DeSantis, actually put in legwork and made the rounds in 2022. He endorsed candidates, he hosted fundraisers, he attended rallies all across the country.
Making himself a national figure.
Exactly, like a national figure and someone who's really willing to go out there for the good of the party and willing to take risks. Because obviously when you make endorsements, you may lose. Your endorsed candidate may lose and it's a mark on your record, but at least you put in effort to help that candidate. He actually got grilled pretty hard on Fox News shortly after the midterms on why a decent number of his endorsed candidates lost. And he ultimately, in this clip we're going to play right here, he ultimately owns up to that fact that his record wasn't perfect. And he handles this with class, I think, and maturity.
So you traveled the whole country, and there were 5 governors who you supported who won out of 15. It's not a great margin. Some said that you, including Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia here in your home state, said that this effort on your part was to generate buzz nationwide and to build momentum for you and for your future. So those losses, what do they say about the candidates, about your ability to help people across the finish line, and about your own future?
Well, first of all, it's not the first time I disagree with Larry Sabato. We went to work hard for governor's races. And what happened in my race was there was an outside candidate who everybody said couldn't win. And Republican governors from around the country came together and supported me. And I will never forget that. And so it was my turn to repay the favor. And we picked hard races where the states were set up a bit like Virginia, where Joe Biden had won by 10 points. And we went to work to try to flip those states. I think that the efforts we put forth showed that, yes, the message carries, but it's hard to unseat. It's hard to unseat an incumbent.
So I got to be honest, Jacob, and again, I may be biased because he's my governor. I think he handled that really well. He didn't deflect, no politician speak. He answered the question. He was like, yeah, some of my guys lost. It happens. He talked about the theme of loyalty, which is especially huge for President Trump. Like, everybody came together to support me. All Republicans all over the country, Trump, George Bush, everybody came out to support me. I returned the favor because I want to help the people who helped me. And he admits, yes, some states are harder to win. Again, Biden won by 10 points in Virginia, and then I came around and flipped it. I got a 12-point swing 1 year later. So, and not every race is going to turn out like Virginia, unfortunately, but I had to at least try for the good of the party and the good of the nation. If anything, that just proves to me he is more serious at this point about presidential ambitions and helping the conservative movement than Ron DeSantis is. Again, Ron DeSantis stayed home during the Georgia runoff. He was nowhere to be heard on the speaker's race. He wants to position himself as a national figure, but he's not willing to take risks. Other than, again, this last minute, half-hearted endorsement for Harmeet Dhillon. Again, quasi-endorsement, like you said, plausible deniability. He can say, "Oh no, I didn't endorse her, so it's not a mark on my record." It's so slimy. And even to tie into that, DeSantis is another one of those politicians. He's positioning himself for 2024. He's doing it in a manner that's like grandstanding, though. He'll do these stupid stunts like, "Oh, I'm gonna bus illegal aliens over to DC." Like, okay, as if that's really gonna solve any problems. Youngkin isn't doing anything like that. He's not doing these big, flashy stunts for the boomers on Fox News or whatever. He is doing what he said he would do. He's doing what got him elected. He is cracking down on CRT and transgenderism and mandates in education. He is giving parents more rights in Virginia. He's sicking his Attorney General Jason Miyares on these schools that pull crap like, hiding test scores and merit awards from some white students because black students might be offended. He's good at putting good people in positions of power. He's getting done what he said he would get done. And that to me matters far more than stunts like, I'm going to bust illegals to, Eric Adams' house in New York City for the lulz. So someone like that is more important for the movement. DeSantis is just not serious. And it comes down to, I think, certainly one key thing about this as well is who are the people who are backing Ron DeSantis. And this goes back to what I was talking about with the calculated ploy effort, the theory for DeSantis that, first off, before we get to that, let's just have our verdict here. Jacob, do you think this was a calculated ploy to set him up as a rival to Trump, or is this just a last-minute fence-sitting decision from DeSantis? What say you?
It sounds like a calculated ploy. It sounds like a very scripted question and very scripted answer.
I agree. I agree with that theory as well. So then that leads back perfectly to this. As I said, the Daily Beast dropped what is perhaps the first ever hit piece on a would-be DeSantis 2024 campaign, highlighting an alleged network of, quote, far-right influencers, end quote, who are being paid to shill for DeSantis online, like coordinated, tweeting all at once. And these things totally exist. These campaigns like tweet certain headlines or certain stories all at once. That's totally a thing. And this article cites among those who are supposedly being paid to shill for DeSantis, Jack Murphy, Dave Reboy, and John Cardillo. So again, Jacob, do you know who any of those guys are?
Jack Murphy, I've heard of Jack Murphy. I don't know who the other two are.
Yeah, I know who they are. They're not very well known, but again, this reflects certainly this Twitter, the relative effectiveness or lack thereof of this Twitter strategy. Like, yeah, these are people active on Twitter who have followers, but does the average Fox News viewer know who these guys are? Does the average Trump rally goer know who these guys are?
No, especially not the average Trump rally goer.
Exactly. But nevertheless, you're seeing these coordinated tweets, and sure enough, it happened like right after the RNC election results were known. All the moaning, the pissing and moaning and crying and whining about, Rhoda won, this is terrible, Harmeet should have won, and the knives came out for Trump. People were going after Trump for supposedly supporting Ronna McDaniel. Now, remember, Trump did endorse Ronna McDaniel when she ran for RNC chair to succeed Priebus in 2017. He stayed neutral in this race. He did not endorse Ronna or Harmeet. He stayed out of it, saying that he liked both of them ultimately. And I think that was the correct move. That was ultimately not only the right thing to do because they are both such terrible candidates in my opinion, but it also was politically the smart thing to do. And I wanted to cite this Twitter thread I came across from a user I'd not heard of before, but he definitely deserves a follow. You guys on Twitter should follow him. He's at MAGA Originalist, MAGA Originalist, who, by the way, has an A+ profile picture. It's Joaquin Phoenix's Joker in his full Joker costume, sitting in the studio, in the green room right before the infamous climax, holding a cigarette, and a MAGA hat is photoshopped on his head. So it's a great profile there. But he also posted this very good thread that I'm going to read mostly. I'm going to mostly read from this thread. And Jacob, feel free to chime in at any point you want to add to this. Quote, Trump, he actually posted this shortly the day before the election. So he's talking in past tense, not knowing what the result would be. So for context, quote, Trump made the right decision staying neutral in the RNC chair election. DeSimps hate this fact, which that's a great term going around for DeSantis shills, is they're simps, and his name's DeSantis, so they call him DeSimps. That's great. Quote, but even if he had endorsed Ronna, it still would have been a good decision because, like it or not, she will win. She had the votes secured long ago. Harmeet is just grifting. Allies are important if you want to win. The online right doesn't realize this. You don't oppose people in crucial positions if there are no better alternatives who could beat them. You don't have to agree with allies all the time. They could still be useful even if they're neocons. Interesting. If Trump opposed neocon McCarthy like the online right told him to, even though they had no better electable alternative, McCarthy still would have ended up as speaker, but no longer an ally. He's now beholden to Trump. Same with Ronna. Same with Elise Stefanik. I'll interject right there. That is 100% true. As we said, it became clear after the fact that the 20 holdouts had no alternative to McCarthy. The one possible viable alternative that you could get people to vote for who's not McCarthy is Steve Scalise. And he made it very clear, like Lyndon Johnson in 1968, he wanted nothing to do with this election. He was not running. He did not want to be considered. So they had nobody. They didn't have Jim Jordan didn't even want their support. He begged his supporters to not vote for him, to vote for McCarthy instead. Byron Donalds was not a serious candidate. None of them were serious candidates for speaker. They had no alternative. Their plan always was, we want to drag this out and get as many concessions from him as possible so he becomes a hardcore conservative. That's why Lauren Boebert could not answer the question when Hannity asked her repeatedly, who would you rather have? There was no answer to that because they had no alternative. They, of course, just couldn't show their hand and say, oh, we don't really want to replace him. We just want to make him more conservative, because then you show your hand and then you lose. So that is true. And referring to Stephanie, especially back when, remember, Liz Cheney was the chair of the House Republican Conference. She was the number 3 position in the House behind McCarthy and Scalise. Trump wanted her gone. Trump very publicly and early on supported Elise Stefanik to replace her. And that, of course, ultimately she did end up replacing Cheney, largely due to Trump's support, because the people who voted for her to replace Cheney were members of Congress who are beholden to their voters who support Trump. So now Elise Stefanik has Trump to thank for her being in a position of power. And not so coincidentally, that is why right after Trump announced his candidacy for 2024, a week after the midterms, Stefanik came out and endorsed his campaign. So it makes perfect sense there.
That's the way the game is played. You can't. I understand that a lot of people are upset that Trump ultimately supported McCarthy. They're upset that Trump congratulated Ronna McDaniel on Truth Social. A lot of people were really fetching about that.
They're so
this
mad.
is how the game is played. You have to have allies. You cannot alienate everybody by being hardcore ideological. It's okay to be ideological, and Trump is ideological, but you cannot progress in politics if you aren't willing to play politics. And a lot of the people who are criticized on the sidelines, especially on Telegram, they simply don't have any political power because they don't understand how the game is played, and they refuse to play the game. So, yeah, there's always going to be a market for that kind of criticism, constant sideswiping and all. But this is power. This is politics. This is life. This is the way it works in the political world. And if you're not willing to play the game, you can't win.
Exactly. Going back to the thread, because this is a really great thread. We'll include the link to the description below. He continues, and just so no one twists this, there's a difference between you endorsing potential establishment allies to help advance your AF movement, America First, and the establishment endorsing you. The latter almost never happens with Trump, unlike with certain others. Very, very true. He obviously got shafted by the establishment for the longest time, even though he would still turn around and support them in most cases, in some cases at least. By the way, I don't think it's right to scapegoat Ronna for the midterm losses. The GOP won the popular vote by 3.5 million. She did well at fundraising. If Harmeet was chairwoman, we still would have lost. McConnell, huge funding disadvantages, election shenanigans were all bigger factors. Now, that's very true because as we discussed in our previous episode, Jacob, when we debated it, Ronna versus Harmeet, I said a main reason why we ultimately lost is because there was no ballot harvesting done. We had 2 years of preparation after 2020 when it became clear ballot harvesting is going to be legal in these key swing states. We need to do it, and Ronna wouldn't do it. Harmeet talked about doing it. But as this guy points out, and as you have pointed out, Jacob, you could argue there technically was a red wave because, yes, the Republicans did get almost 4 million more votes nationwide in the House elections than Democrats did. That usually doesn't happen. Even in 2020, where they picked up 13 seats in the presidential election cycle, Democrats still got more votes nationwide in the House races. That's mostly due to, big California districts and whatnot. So for the first time since, I think, 2010, if I'm correct, the first time since 2010, Republicans beat Democrats in the national House race popular vote. And that's a sign that there definitely was voter sentiment, voters against the Democrats and for Republicans. They were turned out. It just wasn't in certain targeted races. And that's something go ahead.
And I think one aspect that we kind of underemphasized was the reshuffling of voters, because as the country becomes more hardened ideologically, you're going to see a lot more Democrats move to deep blue districts. You're going to see a lot more Republicans move to dark red districts. And so a lot of Republicans have moved, especially since the riots of 2020, since the pandemic and the lockdowns. A lot of conservatives have moved to red states and red districts within the states that they already live in. That's why Texas gained how many? Two congressional seats in Texas? I know Florida gained 2 or 3.
Yes.
A lot of these blue states are losing seats. A lot of
California
conservatives are
lost
simply
seats.
moving to dark. Yeah, a lot of conservatives are dark red seats, so they're running up the score in red districts, but it's not translating into serious wins in the House. That's one of the main problems. People want to live around people who think and vote like them, and it's not really helping Republicans pursue that when they pursue that strategy.
Continuing the thread, MAGA originalist says, quote, "The alliances Trump is making helped the movement advance. Trump and MAGA is taking over the Republican Party. He now has control over the party's nominations, the GOP conference, that's Stephanie's seat, the speakership, absolutely with McCarthy, and now the RNC chair." Very true. These are people who ultimately have Trump's support to thank for them being where they are. Quote, "The online fake MAGA grifters who opposed Trump in any of these events took the L. They've always been taking L's before Trump came along. When Trump saved their butts, they foolishly believed they don't need him anymore." He then posts a tweet featuring pictures of Trump with Elise Stefanik, Ronna McDaniel, and Kevin McCarthy, and says, "Trump has these 3 and others in his pocket. This should be appreciated, not complained about. Trump tried the same with McConnell, but it didn't work out. Getting ousted is now his fate," end quote. That is true. The one leader of the Republican Party that Trump absolutely is done with is McConnell. He's taking shots at him constantly, and rightfully so. McConnell outright opposed him, even with Trump's support. He took funding away from crucial campaigns like Blake Masters and others and put it towards Lisa Murkowski. He's always talking Trump.
And going back to Jim Banks, the idea of him running for Senate, we mentioned this before the election in 2022, that the Senate map is so favorable to Republicans in 2024 that they had a real shot at gaining a supermajority in the Senate if they had mopped up in 2022. If they had cleaned house this election cycle, if McConnell had done what he was supposed to, and because he was sitting on all that money, if he had distributed that money in a way that would have helped Republicans win, if Republicans had picked up 2, 3 seats, even 3 seats, they would have had a real shot at gaining 60 seats in the Senate in 2024 and had a supermajority, a filibuster-proof supermajority, so that a Republican president could ram through any agenda he wanted, could pass any bill he wanted. And because McConnell sat on his hands and was willing to remain minority leader, that's not the case. It doesn't matter how well Republicans do in 2024; they are not going to reach that 60 seat threshold. Now they can hit 54, 55, maybe even 56. They're not going to hit 60.
Exactly. And all because of McConnell's fragile little ego, because he is a sad, pathetic, and petty little man who couldn't stand the idea of a Republican Party, a Republican majority in the Senate without him. And he can't stand Trump and, his politically incorrect way of talking. Last 2 tweets here in this thread. Quote, "These endorsements are unpopular, but they're the practical thing to do. DeSantis showed support for Harmeet. He didn't endorse her, but he made it seem like he did. He's deceiving the base for his own advantage. He knows she has no chance, but he did it anyway." And to this, he then posts a screenshot of a tweet from someone named Peter Schorsch on Twitter, who says, quote, "Interesting that Ron DeSantis is weighing in after a failed attempt to call a special meeting of the Florida GOP to take a position on the RNC race. Why didn't DeSantis make these comments a week ago when they were more actionable?" And that's a very good point that Peter makes here, that MAGA originalist highlights. Because I was arguing with friends in group chats about this, of like, oh, at least DeSantis took a stand. Trump stayed neutral. That's a cowardly thing to do. I'm like, yeah, he took a stand, a very half-hearted stand, a half endorsement / a kind of semi-not endorsement, the day before the election. In an election like this, especially, a last-minute endorsement from the outside looking in from a popular governor means nothing. It's about the weeks and months ahead of time of talking to RNC committee members to whip votes, to schmooze them, take them to dinner, wine and dine them, whatever, and convince them behind closed doors, smoke-filled rooms, whatever, all the political cliches of the fat cat party bosses. That's how it's done. That is what he and his surrogates would have been doing if they really supported Harmeet, but they didn't. Where was DeSantis? Where were his people on this? They were nowhere to be seen. So that tells you all you need to know right there. Final tweet in the thread, quote, "His support serves no purpose other than a talking point for his propagandists to help them attack Trump. Trump is putting America first. DeSantis is putting DeSantis first." Great tweet. Everyone go follow him. So true. Everything he said there is true. And this just proves DeSantis is just a slimy career politician. He's hedging his bets. He's sitting on the fence, but he is also making these calculated ploys that aren't actually meant to change the party. They're not meant to help the party, like actually influencing the RNC race. They're meant to boost his profile so he can position himself as the new outsider. Oh, Trump is the establishment now. Trump is the swamp. I am the fresh new young blood, which is just laughable.
Trump is the establishment outsider. I am the outside outsider.
I'm the outside outsider who served for 5.5 years in Congress before being elected governor, only after a failed Senate bid, by the way. You got fun little fact. I've been doing some Oppo research on DeSantis and just looking at his career. An wholly unremarkable career in the House of Representatives. DeSantis was first elected, by the way, to Congress in 2012. Jacob, let me ask you, had you ever heard of Ron DeSantis prior to him running for governor in 2018?
Well, I mean, I'd heard the name. I knew Ron DeSantis was a congressman from Florida. That was the only thing that I knew about him. Someone who's not a political nerd like we are, they wouldn't have known about him.
Exactly. And all you need to know is that this guy has always been keeping his eye on his next job. So a little trip down memory lane here, Jacob. Remember, of course, in 2016, when we had the largest presidential primary of all time up to that point, one of the top candidates, one of the few who actually kind of got ahead of the rest and did okay in the primaries, was Florida Senator Marco Rubio. And do you remember when Marco Rubio, of course, after he got absolutely felted by President Trump in his own home state, he lost the Florida primary. The senator from Florida lost like a double-digit landslide to Donald Trump. So I remember after that primary in real time, there was a infamous press gaggle around Rubio as he was walking through the halls of Congress, like surrounded by senators, those big echoey marble halls. And he said something along the lines of, this will be my last election. I will not seek re-election as senator. Like, he sounded so dead, so defeated. His eyes were down to the floor. I likened it to Nixon's infamous last press conference when he lost the governor's race for California in 1962. And he said, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." And he throws up the double peace sign one last time. He did it triumphantly. This Rubio just did it so low energy. But it sounded like Rubio, once seen as a rising star for the GOP, was bowing out of politics early. And so when he announced he was not going to run for re-election in the Senate, because he totally blew his political capital on a failed presidential bid, one of the candidates who jumped into the mad fray to replace him was then Congressman Ron DeSantis, who at that point had only been elected twice before, 2012 and 2014. So not even a three-term congressman at that point. The initial polling showed that without Rubio in the equation, the dominant Republican the leading Republican for that nomination was Congressman David Jolly. Now, I'm not sure if you remember who that was, Jacob, but David Jolly was a guy who won an election, what was seen as a very crucial bellwether election, a special election for a congressional seat in Florida in 2014. It was sometime in the middle of the year, in the summer, and he ran against a Democrat by the name of Alex Sink, a woman who had been the most recent gubernatorial nominee for Florida in 2010. She ran against Rick Scott and, of course, was defeated by Rick Scott in a very narrow election, as Florida elections tend to be. So David Jolly goes up against a woman who had just run for governor. She had statewide name recognition. She had the funding. She had the infrastructure. And it was seen as a bellwether for the general feel of the midterm elections that year. And David Jolly ultimately ended up beating her. And it was seen as a huge upset and a good sign for Republicans, which, of course, ultimately proved to be true. They had a good year that year. David Jolly was the front runner for that nomination. Now, who is David Jolly now? He's not in Congress anymore. He is now a flaming never-Trumper who regularly goes on CNN and MSNBC and the rest to talk about how Trump is literally Hitler. So in this parallel universe, this alternate timeline, where Rubio stays out of the Senate and DeSantis runs for Senate, which means he can't run for re-election, so he's terming himself out of Congress at that point, David Jolly wins the nomination and maybe wins the election, probably, and we have a flaming never-Trumper in that seat going into the 2022 election, which means he, as of, this up until this January, up until this month, early this month, he would just be finishing his first term as senator, maybe getting reelected, maybe not, who knows? But DeSantis would have given us a never-Trumper in the Senate. So he was never going to win that Senate nomination. He and Jolly and the rest, of course, quickly bowed out when Rubio came back in to run for re-election after all. Then, in the 2018 governor's primary, of course, the race that ultimately finally gave him the job he wanted, he once again, like 2016, was not the original frontrunner. For the longest time in the polling, The lead candidate for the Republican nomination was a guy named Adam Putnam, who was the Commissioner of Agriculture and a former U.S. representative himself. So he had been in Congress, and at the time, he was a statewide office holder. He had statewide name recognition. He had already been elected before. So he had the advantage. He had the polling lead. And Putnam had racked up a lot of endorsements from incoming members of Congress, from several prominent newspapers in Florida, by other statewide officials. Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of Florida, endorsed him. He had the backing, basically, of the Florida GOP establishment. DeSantis had one Hail Mary that he pulled out of his pocket. He went all in for Trump's endorsement. He posted these campaign ads of, oh, I'm so MAGA, I'm America first, build the wall. Famously, remember, with his little kids, building a wall out of toy blocks, teaching his kids to say the phrase, build the wall. And cutesy, kind of dumb, but also kind of fun. And sure enough, it worked. Trump endorsed him, and that put him over the line. He won the nomination and then barely won the election. So realistically,
well, interestingly enough, it was the same story with Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp promised to round up illegal immigrants in his own bus, like he was driving around a bus saying, I'm going to put illegal immigrants in this and ship them out. He was almost a unknown candidate. Trump endorsed him. He sails to the nomination, wins the general election. Same story with DeSantis. Nobody knew who DeSantis was. DeSantis was not going to beat Putnam in the Republican primary. Trump jumps into the fray. His video of his kid building a wall with the blocks goes viral. He wins the nomination and then wins the governorship. So if it hadn't been for Trump, Brian Kemp would not be governor and Ron DeSantis would not be governor. Georgia and Florida, Trump literally sealed the fate of both those governors in both states. And then now we see both of them are turning against him.
Exactly. And that's really what it comes down to, again, in this question of Trump versus DeSantis, among many other things. It's about who is responsible for this movement, who is responsible for America First, for MAGA becoming mainstream on the right. That is now the dominant faction of the Republican Party. DeSantis didn't just come out of nowhere. Brian Kemp didn't just come out of nowhere. None of these people, most of these people that we celebrate the elections of, J.D. Vance, we love J.D. Vance. He would not be where he is now if it weren't for Trump's endorsement. It is President Trump. He is the kingmaker, and he still has fight in him. He still has fire in him. He deserves this one last chance. He has more than earned one last shot at the title. If he can't pull it off, then frankly, I think nobody can. So the audacity for someone like DeSantis to come along and to, in return for all that Trump has done to give him his political career, basically spits in his face. And for the longest time, too, all of his surrogates have been taking pot shots at Trump, saying that Trump is a failure, that DeSantis is the new face of the America First movement, while DeSantis himself has been being so cheeky about it and being coy by keeping quiet and not saying anything. All these people, these billionaires, these multi-billionaires, like Ken Griffin and others, supporting DeSantis after they previously financially supported Barack Obama and other left-wing causes, they now are backing DeSantis. This infrastructure is clearly being built up in waiting for him to run. And he just sits there and plays cute about it and is like, not going to talk about it, doing the thing politicians do. They generally don't really want to run until they want to run. Whereas Trump, of course, got right out there and said, hey, I'm running. Let's do this. He's being just brutally honest like he always is. So all this is, to me, again, we need to remind everybody, this is just the culmination of a long-term media psyop to try to get one anti-Trump, non-Trump candidate to stick. They tried it with Nikki Haley. They tried it with Kristi Noem. They were just shopping around, kind of like the 2012 primaries against Romney. Conservative voters were shopping around for an anti-Romney candidate, except that was actually organic. Versus here, it's establishment figureheads and donors and lobbyists trying to get their candidate, their nice little neocon like a Nikki Haley. And finally, Ron DeSantis stuck. They wanted to create this fake feud between Trump and ex-Republican to run against him. Even when there was no bad blood there was no bad blood between Trump and Ron DeSantis up until all of these shills and these special interests started pushing so hard for DeSantis, and Trump obviously took note of it and is like, well, I'm not going to take this lying down. These people really want to try to get this guy to run against me. I'm going to defend myself and remind people why I'm the better candidate. Then they turn around and get mad at him for defending himself. But that's all this is. Supporting DeSantis is the same as supporting the establishment. He's the current thing. He's not going to be revolutionary. He's not going to get anything done. There's certainly are things that Trump would do that DeSantis will never do. Do you really think, Jacob, for a second, that someone like DeSantis is going to take a sledgehammer to the deep state like Trump would? I don't.
No, not at all. I mean, he was a former JAG officer.
That's true. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, no, he's not gonna be serious about taking on the deep state. Trump, he may not make popular decisions. Again, endorsing McCarthy and endorsing McDaniel, he's doing these for calculated, pragmatic reasons, because at the end of the day, that's what he is. He's a businessman. He's a pragmatist. He compromises. He cuts deals. Sometimes it's a deal with the devil. Sometimes it's a handshake with fingers crossed behind your back. Whatever. He does what he needs to do because it's the hand he has been dealt. He plays with what he has got, rather than whining online about like, oh, I really wish Paul Gosar could be speaker and Mike Lindell could be chair of the RNC. Like, that was never gonna happen. All right. Trump is a realist about this stuff, whereas DeSantis is pandering to those idealistic keyboard warriors who apparently are being paid to keyboard war for him, pandering to their desires for perfection that are never going to materialize under a DeSantis, and realistically have a better chance of materializing under a second Trump term, where he does not have to worry about running for re-election, and he can go ham, he can go full scorched earth and burn it all down from the first day he walks in there. And that's one other thing, too, is that DeSantis really could learn a thing or two about the value of patience. Because you got to keep in mind, again, this is President Trump's realistically last chance to run for president. He's in his mid-70s. He's getting older. He's not, he's certainly nowhere close to being Joe Biden levels of senile yet. By contrast, DeSantis is 44 years old. So as of right now. So then come 2025, assuming Trump then serves, you get Trump in there, he serves the full term and is out of office come 2029. By that point, DeSantis is going to be exactly 50 years old. So a little bit older, but still young in political standards. He has plenty of time left to run for president. All he has to do is wait for Trump to finish a second term, and then he will probably still have the popularity, assuming he doesn't run against Trump. If he runs against Trump in 2024, he will completely kneecap his own political ambitions, because there will always, from that point on, be a significant portion of the base that opposes him, purely because he tried to stop Trump from being the nominee. And will that have been worth it in the end, Ron? With all of those donors, all the special interests shilling so hard for you that you couldn't put it off for just 4 years. Finish your second term as governor, no less. They'd be asking him to interrupt his second term as governor. I have friends in Florida who fiercely say they don't want him to run for president in 24 because they want him to be there for a full 4 years. They don't want him taken away from them. They want him to do serve the second term, then be term limited out. So if he can't even understand the value of patience, if he caves to the special interests, that will only further prove he is nothing more than a puppet for said special interests, who, again, their goal is to just get rid of Trump. And they see DeSantis as the best weapon, as the best battering ram for getting that job done. So he will prove once and for all where his loyalties lie and what he's really about if he does choose to run against Trump in 2024. And on that note, that is all the time we have left for this special episode, this very important topic that we discussed here on episode 91 of The Right Take. Thank you guys so much, as always, for tuning in. Be sure to follow us for all of our latest content at our website, righttakepodcast.com. The full list of podcast platforms and social media websites where we are available, righttakepodcast.com/subscribe. And as always, if ever you guys are feeling so generous and want to continue supporting the show and everything we do here as we continue our march to episode 100, righttakepodcast.com/support. We'll talk to you next week, guys.